And so Japan came back and gave us basically some ultimatums or demands that we had to do. And of course, we wouldn't do those. And as a result, the relationship got really bad, and the Japanese began to make plans for an attack upon the United States. Now, I think about this historically in a lot of ways, on how bright it was for the Japanese to bring us into this war. And it just didn't seem that bright to me. They must have had some reasons for it. But they did, and it was a terrible situation. It was an act of terrorism, actually, is what it was. Only probably compared to the 9/11 attacks that happened on 9/11. So we'll talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor and war declared by the United States. Now again, we could spend a lot of time probably on this Pearl Harbor thing. And I do have a video coming that I want to show you that I thought was going to be here by yesterday, and it was delayed. So we're going to watch a History Channel video on Pearl Harbor that will give you some more info. But we'll give you, the things I think you need to know. Well, it was on Sunday of December 7th, 1941, that Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet that was stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Again, it was on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, that Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And the United States was completely taken by surprise. And the attack produced some serious losses for the United States, and I'm going to give you some examples and details of those losses. So again, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States was taken completely by surprise. The attack produced some serious losses, and I'm going to give you 3 examples of serious losses for the United States. First of all, 21 ships that were stationed, American ships that were stationed in Pearl Harbor, were either sunk or suffered severe damage. 21 ships, American ships that were stationed at Pearl Harbor, were either sunk or suffered severe damage.
This sheet you gave us is incomplete.
I know. We're going with mine.
Okay.
Yeah. And I worried a little bit about that when it was handed out, because sometimes these numbers get crazy. 21 ships were sunk or suffered severe damage. 188 aircraft that were sitting on the ground at Pearl Harbor were destroyed, and 159 more were damaged. So 188 aircraft that were sitting on the ground at Pearl Harbor were destroyed, and 159 are damaged. I don't even know if that sheet states that. It mainly gave you that map, to be honest with you, so you could see kind of the directions they came from, etc. So 188 aircraft that were sitting on the ground at Pearl Harbor destroyed, 159 damaged. The thing that probably made the most difference to Americans was that 2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed. 2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed during this attack on Pearl Harbor. 2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed, and another 1,178 were wounded in this assault. So 2,403 American sailors and soldiers were killed during the attack upon Pearl Harbor, and 1,178 were wounded. Of all the ships setting in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack, the hardest hit was a battleship called the USS Arizona. The USS Arizona was the hardest hit battleship. And in that battleship alone, 1,177 men lost their lives. So the hardest hit battleship was the USS Arizona, and in that vessel alone, 1,177 men lost their lives. Now, you probably know this, and I've never gone over to see it, which is on my bucket list, but this American battleship, the USS Arizona, is still submerged in Pearl Harbor. I'd like to see it. How many have seen it? I wish I could get over there. I don't know if I could make the flight, but I'm going to give it a try. But the American battleship is still submerged in Pearl Harbor, and many of the sailors or soldiers that were killed in that ship are still buried inside the Arizona's hull. And so that, that's a big memory, negative memory. Yes?
Still
It is, yeah, and it's a very good point. It's still leaking oil. Doesn't it bubble to the surface? Yeah, from inside the hull. Now, I'm going to tell you kind of an odd story on that. Obviously, there were some survivors of the U.S. Arizona. one of the survivors of note that we'll talk about later in our lectures is Jim Leavelle. Does anybody know who Jim Leavelle is? Anybody impress me with that? Jim Leavelle was a man that also took part in another major piece of American history, and Jim Leavelle is the man that was handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby. He was a detective in the Dallas Police Department, and he was a USS Arizona survivor. If you can believe a guy could be in two realms of history. Now, we may get a chance to talk to Jim on the phone. He's 97 years old now, and he still travels and speaks in symposiums, not only about his handcuffing to Lee Harvey Oswald and that story, which you'll learn about later, but also his surviving of the USS Arizona. So, real good friend of mine. He is getting older as time has gone on. But here's the famous Pulitzer Prize winning photograph of Jim Leavelle right here at the moment that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. He also is a survivor of the USS Arizona. So that's incredible. Now, what were the Japanese losses during their attack on Pearl Harbor? 64 Japanese pilots were killed, and one was actually captured. 64 pilots were killed, and one was captured. And the Japanese lost 29 aircraft in this attack, and 5 what they called midget submarines were lost as well. So 29 aircraft lost, 5 midget submarines, and 64 pilots killed, 1 captured. Well, the next day, and you know some of this from your history, the next day on December 8th, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed Congress about this attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, and he referred to the events at Pearl Harbor as a day, quote, which would live in infamy. So on the next day, on December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and spoke to Congress about this attack by the Japanese upon Pearl Harbor, and he referred to the events at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, as a day which would live in infamy. What was the next thing President Roosevelt asked Congress to do? To declare war. And he asked for a declaration of war against Japan, because the only branch of the government that can officially declare war upon another country is Congress. And both branches vote. The Senate votes and the House votes. Okay? That they both vote. Now, this was an interesting thing, and it's going to bring me to the topic that we talked about. Congress granted Roosevelt's request to vote on a declaration of war. The Senate voted to a person. No nay votes. No nay votes. The House had 1 dissenting vote. 1 vote, a congressperson voted against declaring war on Japan. So when this went to Congress, the Senate voted unanimously without 1 dissenting vote, whereas the House had 1 dissenting vote. And that lone nay vote came from a Montana congresswoman by the name of Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin. And it was unusual for a congressperson to be a woman at the time. This is 1941, and so she was kind of an anomaly in herself to be a female congresswoman. But she voted no. And incidentally, Jeanette Rankin also voted no when the President Wilson asked for a declaration of war going into World War I. So thus she goes in American history as the only member of the Congress to vote no for entrance in both World War I and World War II. Now, that was courageous to do that. And there's a possible subject for you to write about in that essay if you thought about that. We're going to give you some more information on her. Now, 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, 3 days after the United States declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. So 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. And what did we do in turn? Declared war on both Germany and Italy. So, at this point, on December 11th, 1941, for the United States of America, World War II had begun. We had entered the war. Now, if you rifle through real quick, like through your binder, find that reading assignment that I have in there that's on Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin. So So fiddle through there and find that. It would be this way. It'll be right after the Pearl Harbor handout I gave you. Okay, I'm going to borrow Kyle's a minute. We'll just take a look at this. I want you to read from the following book, The American Portrait, Jeanette Rankin, 1880 to 1973. I want you to read through that. I want you to answer the questions on the back. How many members of the House voted against World War I? How many voted against World War II? Okay, you're going to have to do a little research there. Why did Jeanette Rankin decide not to run for re-election in 1942? And should members of Congress vote according to the views of their constituents or their own views? Write a persuasive essay defending one of those viewpoints. In other words, should, I use, you know what a constituent is? The people that elect them. So Jeanette Rankin's constituents were the people of Montana. Should she vote on entering the war or any other reason on what she feels or what she thinks the constituents or the people of Montana feel? And you'll have to determine by reading this which way you think she went. Yeah. I just want you to, whatever, if you can fit it on here, that's fine. What I want you to do is just, defend your viewpoint and whether a member of Congress should vote according to their views or the views of the people they represent who elected them into Congress, okay? This will be due on Monday by 4 p.m. So write that down, Monday, 4 p.m., and then we'll talk about it Tuesday. Okay, let's move on then to Japanese removal. Japanese removal. This is kind of a sad story, and to be honest with you, in all the years I've taught this, and I've told you this before, that I haven't taught this material until you guys came about, because I always, in the recent years, taught from 1960 to the present. So I never really talked much about Japanese removal when I taught in Montana, because it didn't hit home a lot, but it hits home in Wyoming. So we're going to talk about a little bit. It's very interesting. So when we talk about Japanese removal, this is kind of hard for me to believe, and I think you know some of this, but I don't think you know all of it. Now, immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the west coast of America, which was closest to Hawaii, right, began to get a little bit nervous. They began to fear things like spies and sabotage and maybe some further attacks, and their thought was if the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they may continue on, and what would be the first area of the United States they would hit would be the west coast. So there became a little paranoia on the west coast that began after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The west coast residents began to fear maybe having spies in, say, California, or somebody sabotaging or doing terrorism on the west coast, maybe further attacks upon the west coast. And so what happened is these local politicians on the west coast and the media whipped up hysteria against Japanese Americans that were living in this country. And that was about 112,000 at the time. So because of this paranoia and the media, making a big deal out of this, and local politicians in, say, California and Oregon and down the coast got all wound up and got hysteria going, people started to have kind of fear or look negatively at Japanese Americans that were living in the United States, which I said were about 112,000 at the time. Well, President Roosevelt got involved politically, and in early 1942, he issued an executive order, which is the president's able to do, a presidential executive order, which was named Executive Order 9066. So he responds to these anti-Japanese fears and the paranoia on the West Coast against Japanese Americans, and he signs into law an executive order, which the president has the right to do, called Executive Order 9066. And basically what this Executive Order 9066 did is it authorized the War Department to force Japanese Americans from their West Coast homes and hold them in relocation camps until the war ended. So they basically just uprooted these Japanese Americans that lived on the West Coast and put them in these relocation camps. And they had to stay there for the rest of the war. Now, Does that seem right in today's thought process? But then it was a big deal, and people supported it. Matter of fact, there was a general by the name of John DeWitt, and he was charged with the defense of the West Coast. They gave him the job of defending the West Coast against any possible Japanese sabotage or attacks. And when he was asked if he thought that that was right, to relocate these Japanese Americans from the West Coast into these relocation camps, he said, quote, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." Wow. So, General John DeWitt, who was in charge of defending the West Coast from any possible spies, sabotage, further attacks, when asked if he thought it was right that they were relocating Japanese from West Coast homes into these camps, he said, quote, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." Wow. Well, you can imagine these Japanese Americans were a little bit in shock. Matter of fact, about 67% of the Japanese Americans that were living in the United States at the time were born in the United States. They were what you call native-born American citizens. So they didn't come here. They weren't born in Japan and came to the United States. Some of them were, right? About 33% were. But the big majority, 67% of these people that were being relocated, were actually born in the United States and were native citizens. Okay? Now, if you look at the map I gave you, you can see that the War Relocation Authority, is what they called it, moved these prisoners to hastily build camps in desolate areas of California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Arkansas, and most importantly for the history of this state, Wyoming at Heart Mountain, which is not far from here. So, the War Relocation Authority, and I don't know if you need to write all these states down, you do have the map, but the War Relocation Authority moved these Japanese prisoners, basically, to hastily built camps, which means they were built quickly and probably weren't the nicest. They weren't the Hilton, I can assure you. Pretty awful. And they put them in these desolate areas of several states: California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Arkansas, and Wyoming. And the one in Wyoming is known as Heart Mountain. Anybody been there, by the way? Is it pretty interesting? I've never been there.
They were really nice.
Huh? Yeah, well, good. I'm glad you had an opportunity. Really nice museum. I might have to think about it. Now, here's what's really ironic about that. Where were there a pretty large concentration of Japanese people living? In what particular state? What other one? Not too far from Pearl Harbor. Well, actually right there. Hawaii. So here's something ironic. The Japanese Americans that lived in the state of Hawaii, who you would presume would maybe pose a greater threat because of their proximity to Japan, you might think they might be a little more loyal to the mother country. These Japanese Americans that lived in Hawaii were not relocated. They were not imprisoned. They did not imprison those. And to me, it seems like they, when you have this way of thinking, might have been more of a threat than the ones that lived in California because they were close to Japan, maybe would have had ties. Why didn't they relocate those? Too much work is kind of it, yeah. Well, that's a good guess, but not right. Yeah? Why didn't they move them? I'm going to be somewhat sarcastic. Not enough work. Okay, now think about it. It's totally probably not what you're thinking, but they didn't move them because there wasn't enough work. Go ahead.
They're on an island out in the middle of the ocean anyways.
Well, that doesn't mean they couldn't be subversive. There were too many to make, and made a big difference. What did the Japanese Americans do in Hawaii at this time? Were they owning businesses? No, they were the unskilled labor. And if so, they would have relocated all of these Japanese Americans from Hawaii. The state would have gone down the tubes economically because they wouldn't have had any workers. That's why they didn't do it. The people provided most of the unskilled labor in that state, and the Hawaiian economy could not survive without them working. So they left them there. And if you are from California or the West Coast, you'd be wondering, why did they not leave me where I was? But they did not. Now, come on now. Is all these Japanese Americans going to just take it? No. You're going to have a few protesters. And the first Japanese American to resist this movement was Gordon Hirabachi. And I won't guarantee you that's correct pronunciation. Gordon Hirabachi. I think it's pretty close. And he was actually a student at the University of Washington at the time. Gordon Hirabachi. He was a student at the University of Washington. Now, he had already gotten in trouble with the government, so he was going to get in trouble again. Okay, so this would not be his first brush with disagreement with the federal government, because earlier he got in trouble when he registered for the draft as a conscientious objector. And you need to know what that is, because when we talk about the Vietnam War, that becomes huge. So he's required to register for the draft, right? We let the, what law did we pass that made that happen? Anybody got that at the top of their head there? Roosevelt, what did he pass? Come on now. The Burke-Wadsworth Act? Does that sound right? Okay, it asked men between the age of 18 and 25, or maybe it was older than that. I can't remember the ages off the top of my head.
21 to 30.
21 to 35, that they had to register for the draft and do a year of military training. Well, when Hirabachi went in to register for the draft, he registered as a conscientious objector. Anybody know what that is? And you have the right to do that. He's an objector to the reasons we're going to war. And then if you do that, then you have to go to a hearing. Okay.